Chapter 3. Suhayok felt his insides churning. He thought he understood why and how the video he'd just watched and the place were created. I'm sorry, but don't be too disappointed. Even after death, you'll be remembered as a hero. Damn it, is this what he meant? He figured he was still being revered as a hero due to Ilsu. In the past, Suhayok was the face of Blue Eyes itself, and Blue Zone was an allied guild that was sort of their shadow. In a world without the Blue Eyes Guild, Blue Zone would have had to either fall off or take Blue Eyes' place. In order to make his guild stand out in Blue Eyes' place, Ilsu probably needed the name and halo of Blue Eyes, and honoring Lee Suhayok as a hero was the perfect way to publicly take both of those things while seeming humble. You bastard, Suhayok murmured in a low voice. A few people glanced at him, but he was too angry to care. Wish. He turned away before the video ended. There was no reason to keep watching. The more he saw Ilsu's face, the more uncomfortable he felt. Tap, tap. Maybe it was due to the blood rushing through his head during his suppressed rage, but as he passed the photos, items, and videos of himself in his past life without so much as a sideways glance, he only heard the sounds of his own footsteps. Finally, farther into the memorial hall, something in particular caught Suhayok's eyes. Visitors had left a pile of flowers in front of his photo. Flowers? It seemed most hadn't arrived empty-handed. He looked at the chrysanthemum flower he'd purchased on his way there. There were so many flowers in front of the photo that his flower would only be one among many. It felt strange to think that so many people remembered him. Swoosh! He placed the flower in front of his photo and truly felt the weight of realizing his old self. The Lee Suhayok everyone remembered was dead, and 20 years had passed. A strange feeling enveloped him for a while. Oh! After some time, he felt a familiar magic power in the pile of flowers. He reached out and searched through the pile, which caused others to start staring, but it wasn't the time for him to care about that. Finally, within the piled-up chrysanthemums, he discovered an unusually transparent ice flower. Don't tell me! He picked the ice flower up and felt a cold chill through his fingers. A chrysanthemum made of ice. His eyes widened in surprise. Saiwu, he made this. Suhayok turned and thoroughly looked through the memorial hall. His heart was pounding. Since the ice flower hadn't completely melted yet, the one who'd left it there probably hadn't gone far. Somehow, we managed to survive another year. On top of the clock tower overlooking the memorial hall, an old man with a hunched back looked down at the building. Once again, it was nerve-wracking. Behind him, a woman wrapped in a robe appeared from the shadows beneath the tower. As if wanting to complain, she bit her thick, red lips and asked, "Did you really have to bring that? We should have just left a normal chrysanthemum." KSSS. The skin on the old man's face peeled away, revealing a young man's face in its place. Kim Saiwu. He was a member of Blue Eyes who'd supposedly died 20 years prior. You never know. That guy might come back to life and find the flower I left. Do you still think he's alive? The woman asked. We didn't see him die with our own eyes, did we? The woman stopped trying to argue. That wasn't the first time they had such a conversation. She had already heard Kim Saiwa's arguments many times. There was a problem, though. The problem is that there's a chance Kim Ilsu will find our location faster than we can find Suhayok, assuming he somehow lived. Naturally, there was a chance Blue Zone would find the flower first. They were certain Ilsu was alive, and the chances of Suhayok being alive were close to zero. You never know, Saiwu said, betting everything on that one phrase. Every year, on the same day, he'd gone there and left that flower. If Suhayok ever saw it, the flower would be enough to let him know to look for them. Saiwu passed by the woman and vanished into the shadows. The woman let out a sigh. If that guy were alive, we wouldn't be hiding like this, you idiot. Once again, she'd failed to stop him. Though Suhayok searched the area near the memorial hall for hours, he couldn't find Saiwu. Only after the sun started setting did he give up and return to his lodging. The small room was barely bigger than 13 square meters and was just big enough for a single bed, a desk, and a chair. The entire room was his home. Without even thinking to shower or change, He threw himself onto the bed. Flop! He thought about the ice flower he'd taken from the memorial. In the same way each person had a different fingerprint, each person also had a different color of magic. No matter how strong they became, the color never changed. It didn't matter how much time had passed. There was no way he wouldn't be able to recognize his longtime friend's magic. So he's alive. He'd thought they were all dead, but that didn't seem to be the case. Though the news had reported Kim Saiwa's death, the flower was clear evidence to the contrary. Suhyok activated his player kit. There were no saved contacts, and he was only using it for search purposes. Do you want to search Kim Saiwu? He tried to see if he could find any news related to his friend, but there was nothing indicating he'd survived. Thud. Suhyok threw the kit toward the head of the bed and turned to the half-melted ice flower. His friend was alive and in hiding somewhere, and he'd been in hiding for 20 years. The only trace of him was the ice flower. "Hey, what are you doing?" he mumbled, knowing Saiwu wouldn't possibly be able to hear him. He wasn't sure if Saiwu was the only one who'd survived, but even if he wanted to contact them, he had no way of doing so. You had to register someone's fingerprint in a player kit to contact them, after all. At least he was certain about one thing: revenge aside, he had another reason for needing to rise to the top. Well, I guess what he's doing doesn't matter. He smiled brightly for the first time that day. He'd been reborn in a world full of people he needed to kill after losing the comrades who were like family to him. The loneliness and burning anger in his chest subsided a bit. As long as he's alive, we will be able to meet again. Right? It didn't matter what his friend was doing. What mattered was that he was alive. All he could do at the moment was pray that others had also survived. Contacting them right now would be dangerous. He calmed himself a bit and tried to organize his situation in his head. They have to have a reason for hiding, so I shouldn't draw attention to them. He was planning to climb the tower. He was well aware of the abilities he'd used in his past life, and if he started climbing the tower with them again, it would undoubtedly draw quite a bit of attention. What would happen if he contacted the presumed dead Saiwu while he was being scrutinized? Blue Zone and the other guilds would certainly take notice. First, I need to regain my power. There were only 2 days left until the tutorial that would allow him to regain his player status started. He sat up on the edge of his bed and thought about his course of action. After thinking about how he could get even more powerful than before, he reached a conclusion. If I could handle lightning properly, things wouldn't have gone that far. Lightning was the most powerful weapon he'd used. The stronger it became, the more damage it inflicted on the user's body. In other words, it was a sharp, double-edged sword. Of course, it was also the best sword in the tower. As expected, the problem is stamina. In his past life, he'd used skills and items that increased his stamina to help deal with the self-inflicted damage from his lightning. Even then, it wasn't enough. He needed a way to reach an absurd amount of stamina. Well, there was no way he would be able to immediately solve a problem that he hadn't been able to solve back when he'd reached the 8th floor. The tutorial. Suhyok looked at the ceiling. The tutorial was the first and most basic trial to evaluate a player's capabilities. I wonder how many stages I can clear now, he murmured as he recalled the contents of the trial. Every player had probably wondered, at least once, how far they would be able to go if they could replay the tutorial. Such thoughts were flights of fantasy, but Suhyok had a unique opportunity. In my past life, I reached stage 25. It was a record-breaking number. Even after 20 years, though all information about the tutorial had become known, only 2 players had beaten that record. Climbing the tower again won't be a problem in itself, but that isn't good enough. I need to do better. His gaze turned to the sword placed in the corner of the room. Since the tutorial was coming up, he'd prepared his weapon in advance. He reached out and grabbed the sword. A familiar feeling spread evenly from his fingertips through his body, and he smoothly drew the weapon from its sheath. It wasn't very good, but that made it feel even more like a fresh start. I must do well. It was just a tutorial, but he had to give it his all on every trial and trial he faced. Climbing the tower wasn't enough. Instead, he needed to succeed in everything with near perfection. His gaze fell upon the mask he'd left on his desk. In essence, he had to beat none other than himself. For 2 days, Suhayak gave himself time to get used to his new body. He felt heavier, his feet were sluggish, and his sword also wasn't as light as he was used to. 2 days were enough for him to adapt, though. He'd repeatedly swung his sword and moved in a hunting ground near the village for the past 2 days, and he encountered a few of the lowest-ranking monsters that appeared nearby during his training. "How did you get beaten up so badly despite having such a body?" he asked himself. After all of his practice and a few fights against the easiest monsters, he was more aware than ever that he'd lucked out with the body he received. All of his stats were over 10, and concentration was at 14. He'd unlocked magic power without having gone through the tutorial and was clearly very talented, just based on his stat numbers alone. The previous owner of the body just hadn't been able to use it all properly. Good. Even compared to his past self, it might have been a better foundation. Since he died, something called player training institutions had popped up that offered professional training until the moment a player entered the tutorial, so it was only natural. He'd been dissatisfied with his start at first, but after taking some time to judge it more objectively, he thought his new body was quite excellent. Chirp, 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 the bird chirped in the early morning air. Suhayak, who'd moderately sweated from his warm-up, lifted his head. He'd been keeping his senses heightened since he woke up. So it's starting. The day of the tutorial had dawned. It was the day of Suhayak's return.